That was telling for the lightning talks. You all quieted very fast, so it's a good start. Welcome to session 13, lightning talks. We have 6 speakers today, 6 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So as always, put your questions in the app, and we will get to those when the time comes. And we have everybody here, so we can go. So our first speaker is Candice, and she's going to be talking about ecological innovations in Dutch offshore wind farm projects, case study of Shell's contributions.
And this progresses it? Oh, a clock. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in because I am on the clock. So similarly to the Mid-Atlantic, as you can see, the North Sea, the Dutch North Sea is a very busy marine area. You have a myriad of activities and competing priorities that include commercial fishing, oil and gas, military operations as well. There's also a key focus and targets for environmental conservation, as you can see in the green areas on the map. And in the midst of this activity are ambitions for offshore wind development that are set at various country levels, and that in order to be achieved will obviously require a significant increase in offshore activity, as well as additional use of marine space. And as such, striking a balance between nature conservation as well as energy production is really at the heart of many of the Dutch North Sea ambitions. And so Shell has been active in progressing these ambitions from the beginning with our involvement in the development and operation of Noordzee Wind, which you can see in the purple. And this was the first experimental wind farm that really was leveraged to understand the environmental impacts of offshore wind ahead of formal build-out. And then following Noordzee Wind, we have Blauwind in the yellow, which has been operational since 2021, and then Crosswind in the red, which has been operational since 2023. And then our most recent acquisition, which is Ecovende in the green, which is expected to be operational in December 2027, and was part of a precedent-setting bid, HKW bid, that placed ecology as a focal scoring criteria. And we'll get into that a little bit more. That said, although ecology was at the center of the Ecovende bid, it has been a focal consideration in a number of our other offshore project deliveries. So with Blauwind, this has taken the form of a project launched in 2020, which saw the reintroduction of the flat oyster, which has been extirpated from the Dutch North Sea since around the 1950s. And this effort involved the placement of 2,400 flat oysters at the base of turbines using constructed oyster tables. And as you can see from the 2023 Summer Monitoring Program results, these results are quite promising, showing high adult survival rates as well as ongoing natural continued reproduction. And this project has really highlighted the role that offshore wind projects can play, both in nature enhancement but also species recovery. But as mentioned, the HKW bid, which led us to the acquisition of the Ecovende parcel, really established a significant shift for the offshore wind, with the Dutch government challenging bidding parties to devise solutions to contribute to the biodiversity of the North Sea as a key component of their bids. No less than 50% of the allocated points were associated with ecology. And out of 8 bids, Shell and Eneco's submission was identified as the most ecologically innovative and is set to be the first offshore wind farm in the Dutch Sea that both integrates and enhances the natural ecology. And so this is anticipated to be done with a significant number of proposed solutions and experiments that really aim to do a number of things, 3 key things: minimize negative impacts to birds, bats, and marine mammals, while also enhancing the benthic and marine environment. And this will also be coupled with a significant, extensive monitoring program that's set to fill key knowledge gaps for ongoing learning and development. So in regards to specific measures that are proposed, at the avoidance level, there are a number of options for turbine installation that will be tested to assess opportunities to reduce marine noise. Specifically, we'll look to use large-scale vibrohammering in place of pile driving, and this will also be tested in combination with an innovative approach called water jetting. And if any of you have followed the news lately, Ørsted just released a story that this was a successful method trialed in Germany. As well, the use of suction buckets as an alternative installation technique will also be considered to determine if there is a potential to fully eliminate noise from construction as well. At the design level, there's been a number of adjustments made to the project design to support avoidance to bird impacts, with turbines along the coastline actually having created an east-west corridor in consideration of an important bird area. As well, hub heights along this corridor will be increased to create more vertical space near the sea surface to further reduce potential risks to birds. Additionally, a number of proposed mitigation measures will support further minimization of overall impacts, and these measures include consideration around bird deterrence, as well as adaptive and location-specific curtailment measures, and these will be supported by incorporation of bird recognition and radar systems on various turbines to allow adjustments to those systems and determination of the go forward with them. As well, a number of visibility options are also being tested, so a UV top coat will be placed on a number of turbine blades that will also be tested for the efficacy of that mitigation measure. In addition, the project will also explore options to reduce lighting, so an example of this is an aircraft detection system is anticipated to be installed, which would allow us to determine whether or not aviation lighting can be utilized only when it's actually necessary. And then last, but definitely not least, in order to support our ambition of having a positive impact on biodiversity, a number of key enhancement efforts will support improvements to the benthic and marine environment. These will include a highly experimental reef stimulation project, as well as the placement of tree reefs. And these reefs will come from discarded fruit trees from the fruit industry and be placed at cable crossings. As well, the project will also look to build on the flat oyster project from Blauwind and expand the oyster larval network within the Dutch North Sea. So in summary, though ecology and nature preservation has been an ongoing consideration in achieving offshore wind ambitions in the Dutch North Sea, it really was shifted when this non-price criteria piece for HKW bid that stimulated this overall increased focus on ecological innovation. And this is really anticipated to be carried forward into future projects. And though I will say that much is yet to be seen in terms of the feasibility and success of all the associated innovations, it is anticipated that these ecological efforts will support a reduction in overall impacts from the Eco-Vendée project and really allow for that continued rollout of offshore wind to achieve the offshore goals of the North Sea.
All right, thanks for that. This is you, yeah. Where'd it go? All right, Remment, take it away.
Thank you very much. My name is Remment Hofstede. I am a marine ecologist and I work at an international marine contractor which is called Van Oord. We're active all over the world, and part of what we do is building wind farms. We're a market leader of wind farm building in Europe. And today I will tell you about a series of research initiatives that we have undertaken to really establish nature-inclusive offshore wind farms, and it's presented in 5 steps. The work has been funded by the Dutch Resource Council and was partly executed at the Technical University of Delft. As you all know, the build of wind farms has their impact on the environment, both risk and opportunities, but as it is a lovely day, I will focus on the opportunities only. There has been a lot of studies going on about opportunities that can arise from building wind farms in the environment, and that has led to many ideas and also many pilots being executed. But the key question currently still is how to act now with all the knowledge available and what knowledge is further needed. So our policymakers, they need to know where to place certain measures for nature development in wind farms, how much of them, etc. And that's why we have developed these 5 steps to achieve nature-inclusive offshore wind farms that really have an impact on the, that makes a significant impact on the targeted ecological components. And it's supposed to become that these measures are not just a nice add-on in our wind farms, but really make that impact at a system scale. And to illustrate these steps, we focus on oyster reef development in the North Sea, as presented earlier by Candice. So step one is to identify the potential of the infrastructure that you make. What has a wind farm to offer? Well, of course, the hard substrate of the infrastructure itself, in particular the rocks at the base of the wind turbine foundations, and a lot of vast space in between the wind turbines that could serve as a marine sanctuary. Then, in the case of oysters, the larvae can easily settle up on the scour protection, and if they get a chance to develop in the sandy area, they won't be fished away anymore. The second step is to define clear objectives. So often we have strategic objectives that are very nice, but we should make them tangible by turning them into operational objectives that we can really implement. And what should you do for that is first make an inventory of the ruling policy, the environmental conditions, and the potential of the infrastructure that you are going to build in an area. Then you see where there is a match between these three, and then the stakeholders involved in the plans should reach agreement on the ambitions that they will set and turn them into operational objectives. So for oysters, there is a desire to redevelop, restore them in the North Sea. It's written in the policies, the environmental conditions are generally good, and the infrastructure, as shown before, has the potential to support that. So it's a match. And then the several stakeholders, the main ones are the authorities, the contractors, the scientists who know all about it, of course, and the developers. And they should define a clear objective, tangible operational objective, which could be placing a number of individuals in a suitable area in all the newly to be built wind farms. Then the third step is to quantify the potential effect of interventions that you can take. So you want to go from a current state to a desired state. You have to first to do the assessment, what's the potential of the desired targeted ecological component regarding its history in the area and in the current system. Then you identify all the interventions that can be taken from mega scale, the larger region, up to micro scale, the material types that you're using, and then you will quantify the effects that all these interventions could have on the population that you want to establish. Then you go to step 4. It's really that any intervention that you are going to implement is really the best developed and the best studied method. For example, if you take the material use, we have studied many different types of materials that you can use as scour protection or place on top of the scour protection. In the end, you will, of course, use the materials that have the best benefit for large settlement. And finally, it's to achieve scale. So there's a lot of knowledge at the industry companies about working at scale. Everything is being done largely. And there's a lot of knowledge about science, about what should be done and what can benefit certain targeted ecological components. But they are not really working together. And therefore, we have developed principles that you should adhere to, both parties, and really find collaboration over the conflict that is currently still around. And then, as an example of one of those principles, is really go into the design phase. So any solution that you would like to implement in your wind farm should already be incorporated in the design of the wind farm. And then it's most cost-effective to stimulate these desired species or habitats. So it was really in short. Of course, all the research is substantiated by more detailed studies, so you can have a look and take a picture and look up whatever you like or ask questions later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Remment. All right, next up we have Matt Bingham.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm Matt Bingham. I'm an economist, and today I'm going to be talking about commercial fishing. And I think most everybody knows commercial fishing in the Atlantic is a really long-standing, important, iconic industry. They've held sway in these waters for, centuries. And so now here comes offshore wind, and so offshore wind over the next several decades is going to be interfacing with commercial fishing to some degree. And one of the things we've seen in a lot of the presentations that we've had here today is that stocks are moving. So, we need to develop I feel like we need to develop a really sophisticated understanding of commercial fishing in order to understand how to interface, how to offset, all the things that could occur over the next several decades. And, fortunate for me, Attentive feels the same way. And so what I'm talking about today is essentially some sort of sophisticated fishery modeling that we've done in support of their COP for AE1. This is where I mess up the switch. Oh, I did. Back up. Goes like that. Sorry. Okay. And so what you're seeing here is a picture that's essentially just what it says. It's a stylized example of surf clam trips. We looked at several different species. Surf clams and scallops kind of had the most potential exposure. Given the sort of lightning format of this talk, I picked surf clams to talk about because they're quite simple. Their trips are like lightning trips. You can see how they come out. Atlantic City is the one I'll focus on. So they come out of Atlantic City looking on those black lines, fish in a polygon that's about that size, various different shapes. They do that for 24, 36 hours until their cages are full. Then they turn around and head back home. So it's pretty simple. And as you can see, all those gray areas are where the stocks are now. But of course, one of the things we might want to be interested in is this is where they are now. This is where they've been historically. But as we've seen, there's a lot of movement towards the north and east. So what would be the implications essentially if these stocks did move? And so the way to do that, we have to understand not just where commercial fishing happens, but basically how it happens. And for that, we constructed an economic model. And this economic model consists of a fleet with its cost functions, spaces on a grid that they can go out and fish to that are populated by catch per unit effort. And so we can bring together some specific information about these vessels in a particular port. So like Atlantic City, there's 6 of them. Based upon where they're going to and the dimensions of the vessel, we can calculate the cost of getting to those places. We create revenue based on catch per unit effort and time on site. And then the rule for them is that they're maximizing profit under uncertainty. And so this is a behavior as opposed to a result. So we can take this kind of thing and change catch per unit effort, and we can make behaviors and profits change. One of the things they have to have is that it has to comport with what the world actually looks like. So I'll show you in a little while that, this is what the trips look like, and, consistency with landings and ports and so forth. Another thing that we were quite interested in is this idea of, how easy would it be to actually use a clamming boat in one of these areas? And you hear everything from maybe to no way in talking to surf clam captains. A typical boat might be about 120 feet. In this region of AE1, the deepest depth is 154 feet. So you can do some calculations and ultimately wind up counting a 45-foot dredge. The whole setup's about 500 feet. And so then we looked at where they have been, and you can see this is an actual trip on the left here. They would have just barely missed this turbine. They could have done that. But they were dredging then, but this isn't a real dredge. That was like a sample dredge, and they didn't find anything, so they quit dredging. Look over to the right, and you can see that when they hit actual dredging, this would be like, trying to cut your grass, and there's a croquet court there or something. It makes it a little bit of a pain in the neck. You have to go around it. So it's different. Can they do it or not? That's the question. So now I'll jump to kind of some model results. And so essentially we look at trips, and these trips come from AIS data, and then we model those essentially. So these are computerized reproductions of trips, but they look just like the trips do if you go look at the AIS data. And so on the right there, you can see that there were some trips that were going into the wind energy area. And so then in the modeling of that, essentially what we do is we make it so they can't do that any longer. As I said, this happens over 30 years. This structure, as you can see, is kind of made to allow stock changes inside there. As of right now, you know, what we were doing was looking at over this 30-year time period, there's going to be parts where it's completely closed off, parts where maybe you have a lower catch, and then parts where it's closed off again for decommissioning. And then on the bottom, you can see all the uncertainties that are involved. So that's surf clamming. I don't have time to talk about scallops. So they're really complicated, much longer trips, multi-stops and so forth, areas that are closed off. But if you guys like this at all and you have any, are on the fence about going to AFS in Hawaii, Jason, my friend, is going to be talking about scallops, and he'll go all the way through these trips and how we go about modeling something that looks like that. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Matt. This is yours here, right?
Yeah, PDF, yeah.
You're just gonna
Just
run it like that.
Control L. Yeah, try
I'll let you do
Control. No. Shoot. I don't know how to do it in Bing. One of these is usually the slideshow button. Maybe that. There we go.
All right. We won't make the time count against you. All right, Joe Warren, take it away.
Thanks. So I'm going to be talking about some monitoring work we've been doing for the past couple of years at the Sunrise Wind lease area. This is a project funded by Hofstede, and the primary focus is looking at sort of the hydrography and the lower trophic food web levels in that region. So we try and get out 3 to 4 times a year. These are pretty brutal trips. They're about 28 hours long, and the boat we go out on doesn't really have bunks. We have beanbag chairs that are pretty comfy. But weather is pretty limited, and it takes us a while to get there because our boat is slow. And we'll be going out there hopefully next week to do another round of sampling. So we've got a pretty decent pre-construction data set at this point, which is exciting. We have 2 grids that we run, one in the lease area, and then I think for the first time in my life since 4th grade science fair, I have a control. Which is pretty unusual in the pelagic survey world. So we have 5 stations at each area where we do CTD casts and a full water column ring net tow. We have 3 transects that we're running multiple frequency acoustic backscatter, and then I'll talk a little bit about a bottom lander we have at the lease site for long-term monitoring. So the team of people, the grad students and techs in my lab, do a great job on this trip. These are just some photos of the boat and what we're at out there, and we have a lot of seasickness. It can get pretty rough while we're out there. We are running 4-frequency echo sounder suite. 3 of those are pretty standard, 38, 120, and 200 kilohertz. We actually have one of the few high-frequency SIMRAD systems, the 710, which lets us resolve copepods using backscatter. And then this is just an echogram of the first trip we went on where we saw a bunch of fin whales working on either a bunker or herring school. And it was great, except it wasn't in our survey area. It was between the 2 sites. So preliminary results, hydrography, not surprisingly, we are not seeing much difference between the regions. We have the lease area at top and then the control site down below. There's been a slight difference in temperature. The control site tends to be a little bit cooler just overall, and that may be the result of us trying to maintain sort of the bathymetry relative to those places. What I haven't done, and because I didn't know Glenn was going to explain everything during his plenary, is I haven't really done a full climatology on this to look and see. I'm pretty sure we'll see that cold water signal and fresh signal that he was talking about. These are acoustic backscatter surveys. Occasionally we've had to drop transect legs because of weather. But the organisms, this is 200 kilohertz, so this is probably a crustacean, zooplankton most likely. They're patchily distributed, but we don't see any obvious patterns, between the two sites. It's a patchy area. And then if you saw Chris Orphanides' talk this morning, we see similar assemblages of copepods. What you're seeing here are those 5 stations for 2023. So we've got spring, early summer, and then the next slide will be late summer and fall. The colors correspond to the different species. And so in the spring, we see a fair amount of variability, but later in the summer, it becomes much more consistent. The one major difference we have compared to what Chris was talking about today is we see a fair number of Temora, which he didn't have in his sort of top 3. But we see Calanus finmarchicus, several Centropoges, and then Pseudocalanus and some others. So just looking at the data we have so far, so this is Centropoges. Control site is blue dots. The wind is the red dots. Zooplankton are patchily distributed, so I'm not surprised we see, station-to-station variability. But so far, we don't see anything obvious that's jumping out in terms of differences between these sites, which is good. Here's Temora. Again, June, we had really high abundances, and then hit or miss, but pretty low the rest of the time. And then Calanus, and I apologize, the color coding switches here. So our control site is now green. The wind lease area is blue, and then the pink or peach dots are from a broader scale New York Bight survey that my lab also runs. And so we found really high abundances of Calanus within the New York Bight on the order that they're sufficient for right whales to be feeding on, and we hadn't really seen those high abundances on any of our project's called Ecopod, so on our Ecopod trips, until this spring. And I initially associated this with us catching the spring bloom, but after Glenn's talk, I'm wondering if this is just a high abundance year. We had several stations with abundances over 1,000 copepods per meter cubed, and that's an average over the whole water column. So these animals are most likely in a layer, so those abundances are really, really high. And we have some other work from our lab talking about the energy available from those copepods to higher level predators that came out earlier this year. So the last thing is we're only out there basically 4 days a year, so we're not really capturing the temporal variability. So we have these bottom landers with echo sounders, we have passive acoustic recorders on them, a microcat CTD, and we're able to look at things like fish schools and copepods and how those vary over time. And this is an active area of research. And one of the advantages of this type of instrument, much like Josh's robots or Mark's robots or whoever's robots, is we get data during Hurricane Lee and Tropical Storm Ophelia when nobody's going to be out there on a boat. So so it's challenging, but I think we've got a really nice data set, and happy to answer questions later on.
Thanks, Joe. Going from copepods to bats. This is yours, right? Yep. This one? Yep. All right, Michael Whitby, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I am the director of the Bats and Wind Energy Program at Bat Conservation International, and I'm sure the first thing you think of when you think of offshore wind is bats. However, surprisingly, bats have been found offshore in quite a few numbers. Additionally, bat populations are threatened due to high fatality rates at onshore wind energy facilities. So any additive mortality from offshore wind could exacerbate problems for these species. So there's a big question of when are bats offshore, because they're offshore, anecdotally, from the best knowledge we have, they're offshore less than they are onshore, and primarily during the migrating season. And by answering this question precisely, we can help inform minimization methods, such as when we need to curtail or shut down turbines. We can, to get at this question, we can use long-term stationary sampling at buoys or other structures, such as the turbines themselves, once they are built. However, there is an additional question of where are bats offshore, and does this vary, and can we sight wind in a different way, or are there riskier or less risky areas? And in order to do that with buoys, you'd have to do a lot of them. And have a sampling design. And due to the limited structures that are available at this time, this is extremely difficult. So in order to do that, we can answer that question with mobile transects. And we have used in the past what we refer to as ships of opportunity. That's ships that happen to be going out that we ask the captain if we can put a bat detector on and have them record while they're out at sea. And that has worked fairly well. However, we are limited in what data we can collect in that method, and it's also not collected in a very designed way to answer targeted questions. So, in order to accelerate our knowledge, we have experimented with additional sampling methods, and today I'm going to talk about using the sail drone uncrewed surface vehicle to sample bats. And so we did this at Southeast Farallon Island on the Pacific because it is a known stopover for the hoary bat. And this species roosts on one or two trees on the southeast side of the island, and there have been counts there since the 1960s, up to 101 spotted in a single day. And so in cooperation with Sail Drone, we attached a SM4 Wildlife Acoustics bat detector on the top and sent the sail drone out to the Farallon Islands for a month. And so this is a map of the track. You can see the track, which changes color based on the date, and then the size of the bat. There is relative amounts of bat activity. And you can see for the most part, wherever the sail drone went, the sail drone detected bats. There was a little more bat activity closer to the island as we would expect, which is right, that corner there is right where the roost is. So we can see that it was successful. And this was actually somewhat of a surprise because sampling bats in the offshore can be challenging. The microphones are sensitive to water and salt intrusion. And so this was highly successful that the bat detector worked. We sent it to an area where we knew bats would be so that we could tell if we got 0 bats that it wasn't working. However, it worked very well. And we recorded over 500 bat calls, close to 1,000 actually. Many, which is typical of bat acoustic surveys, many were unidentifiable. However, we found many Mexican free-tailed bats and hoary bats. So we can see that bat activity was offshore. We can see that we can detect multiple species. And we can see that we discovered that the bat detector worked and it survived a month on the open ocean. And so this method will help us answer the question of are bats attracted to turbines offshore by conducting studies before and after turbines are constructed, and we can, in those studies, establish a gradient of bat activity as we go offshore to see if and when bat activity decreases with distance to shore to help inform risk of bat collisions with turbines. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our cooperators. This is part of a larger study funded by the Department of Energy and BOEM, and with the Electric Power Research Institute, USGS, and many other partners. And if you are interested in the Sail Drone vehicle, Christina from Sail Drone is here, so please talk to her and ask for a bat detector on your mission. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael. All right, moving into gulls. We have Esther, go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Esther Nosazeogie, and I'm a PhD student here at Stony Brook. And I'll be talking about my preliminary work in modeling gull movement. And as offshore wind grows, we have concerns about seabirds. And the most pressing of this is the risk of collision. And basically, the probability of collision depends on the position of the bird relative to the turbine blades. And we can get at this by looking at the movement and habitat use data of these birds. And typically when we think about studying seabird movements, we think about where they are going, which is horizontal habitat use. But to accurately estimate collision risk, we also need to figure out how high they are flying and what determines this. And this is vertical habitat use. And for this project, I'm looking at the great black-backed gull, which is one of the focal species of WOW. And it's sensitive to offshore wind because it flies high enough that it can overlap with the wind turbines. And so this figure is from a field trial. And each box in this box plot represents a device which you can put on birds to figure out how high they're flying. And so in this field trial, these devices were put on a drone, and the drone was flown, and the measurements were compared to a laser altimeter. So the laser altimeter is an accurate device, but it's too big to put on a bird. And we can see from this plot that the red box, which is the axis air, is the most accurate. This is a pressure-based device, but the draw is that it's archival, so for us to get to the data, we need to recover the bird. And this is not suitable because for this project, we want long-term deployment. The other two devices are powered by GPS technology, and the one we're focusing on is the more accurate of the two, which is the Unitrack. And so we can see that it's pretty decent in terms of the measurements, but it still collects data with considerable error. And so my goal is to take the data from this GPS device, figure out what is the truth of the flight height, and quantify the error so that we can have more confidence in collision risk modeling. And so I just want to point out that these Unitrack devices are solar powered, and they transmit data through the GSM network, and so it's suitable for long-term deployment. So far, we have put out 61 of these tags on the birds, and 41 of those were put out this past spring. And so we're excited because we're going to have much more data, and this is a larger sample size than we know for any other study for this species. And so this map just shows where we tag the birds and the proximity to offshore wind areas. And so this is these are movement tracks from birds that we deployed, that we tagged from 2021 to 2023. And we can see that these birds are quite pelagic. And we also often think of gulls as birds that are beach robbers and trash eaters on land, but they do a lot of foraging offshore as well. And also, we have a good amount of these birds going into wind offshore areas in the past 3 years. And so, having established that these birds, in fact, go offshore, we looked at the altitude data that were transmitted from these tags. And if we look at the histogram, basically, this is the range of values that we have from these tags. And the red lines are basically the extent of what we think is reasonable. We think they are reasonable because, for one thing, the highest recorded flight height for this species from boat-based surveys is 300 meters. And also, we know that these are not deep divers, so the negative values are clearly wrong. However, we cannot throw out these extreme values because, for two reasons actually. The first one is that sometimes these birds soar with like rising warm air, and this is called thermal soaring. And when they do this, they can reach altitudes that a boat-based observer could miss. And the second reason is that when we take the data and fit it to statistical models, we could get biased results if we, pull out the ones that we think are extreme. And then I also want to point out that even though this data, there's a lot of erroneous values, if we look at the middle 50% of the distribution, we have quite a reasonable values in those. So it's promising as a starting point. And then our goal is to take this data and model it using a state space model. And we are collaborating with the developer of the Anomotum package. And the reason we're doing this is that most of the packages that we have that lets you make state space models for animal movement data, they are usually designed for longitude and latitude. And so we need custom code to expand this package and also include altitude in the models. And there are a few steps, and right now we are in the first step, which is calibration. And so we're taking data from the field trials that I mentioned earlier, and we're trying to estimate parameters that we can use to calibrate our models. And this is just an example of what's possible. This is a toy state space model, and the black line basically shows estimates from the state space model, which took the blue dots. So the black line is the estimate of the state space model. The blue dots are simulated raw observations, which obviously have error. And the red points are the true states. And so we can see that the black line is pretty close to the estimates. And so our goal is to have this kind of output for the altitude data. And I want to thank the WOW project and SOMAS, which funded this project, and those who helped collect data. And thank you for listening.
All right, thanks, Esther, and thanks, everybody. Let's see, we have some questions here. So first one's for Candice. Can you explain the idea behind tree reefs in more depth? You gotta hold the red button down.
Yeah, so good question. So the idea really comes from the fact that the North Sea used to have, a subsea tree ecosystem to some extent. So it's not like we're building this out of nowhere. So the anticipation is, so again, we're kind of reintroducing the idea. What's anticipated to happen is, like I said, we will be using sort of discarded fruit trees from the fruit industry, and these will be made into sort of various structures that will then be sort of deployed on the subsea within the wind farm. And there have been additional studies preceding this that have shown that these fruit trees actually work to create good habitat for benthic and marine species. So.
All right, thanks for that. Let's see, I think this next one is also for you, Candice. Yeah, so what depth are the wind turbine installations that you have oysters at the base, and do oysters naturally exist at that depth?
So I believe that the Blauwind farm is ranges from about 25 to 38 meters in depth for foundations, and I believe that the oysters have been placed in the shallower regions of that, and that is deeper than I believe them to normally exist. But I think that's one of the really key, surprising results around it, is they're also very temperature dependent on when they breed. So this has really shown that they can exist at this depth, and again, there's going to be further studies on that with EcoVenday as well. So.
Sure.
May I add something to that? Because we were involved in that, and prior to Shell had deployed these oysters in the wind farm, they based their they based this activity on previous studies that really showed that the oysters will reproduce and grow, etc., at these depths. So the pilot experiments fed into the actual implementation of your work.
Great, thanks for that. So Matt, this one's for you. So if the clam dredge is 500 feet long and turbines are about 5,000 feet apart, what exactly is the operational issue? And that's a little bit of a loaded question, but.
Right. I mean, I think that's the question, and I didn't really point it out, but if in that picture, you know, we had taken the amount of space that gets taken up by the boat and the dredge itself, and it really is minuscule. But when you look at how dredging actually happens, and somebody hits a hotbed of clams, and they take into account a lot of things, the slope. They don't want to go this way if the slope is going like this. I think they want to go up. So there's just these various different rules that make it go faster. And you think about surf clamming, what they're wanting to do is to fill up these 5 cages and get back, and they're sitting up on the deck, and especially if it's warm, and it winds up taking them even a few hours longer, then they can't fill up all these cages because they have to get these clams back and get them processed. And so, I think these are the sorts of things that they could potentially run into. So how real of an effect is it? I think that'll be seen in the future.
All right, thanks for that. Let's see. So, Joe, can you provide some more thoughts about how Glenn's findings you presented yesterday, and that question just disappeared, might be playing a role in what you're seeing with your research?
Sure. So one of the issues historically or within the last 10, 15 years has been this shift in Calanus finmarchicus. As the waters around here heat up, we tend to see fewer calfins, and they may be moving north or preferring cooler habitats. So Glenn's discussion about cold, fresh water coming in on the cross-shelf jet raises the issue of either the conditions are better for Calanus here in New York to outcompete the other ones, or maybe there's larval ones or copepodites that are coming in on that slug of water. Or it could just be, we just had a really good year. We had high abundances in 2021 in New York as well, so it's not unprecedented that we would get a lot of calfins here. So it's just, copepods and zooplankton are patchy and moving, and Glenn and Josh think it's the physics, and I think it's the biology, which is varying more, and we're probably all 3 right or wrong equally, so.
All right, thanks for that. Next one is for Michael. About what % of human-induced bat death comes from offshore wind turbines compared to whatever else kills bats out there?
We don't know. And onshore wind turbines, we know through population modeling, we suspect that it threatens the hoary bat and other migratory bats with over a 50% decline, and greatly increases the risk of extinction. So if we're already in decline, any mortality, unfortunately, is additive. Offshore wind possibly could be less than onshore wind, but at the same time, once you have a problem, additive mortality comes into effect.
All right, thanks for that. This one's for Candice and Remment, if you can decide who goes first. Can you each talk about the importance of nature-inclusive design pilot studies preceding full-scale implementation and the challenges and lessons learned you've seen associated with that?
Well, I can give you an example even. In the past, we have tried to initiate a reef development of oysters with the deployment of adult oysters. So we brought broodstock from a foreign country and we placed them at the offshore wind farm area. That has been done with tens of thousands of oysters, loosely deployed without knowing whether they would survive and what would happen with them. So pilot studies are really important to make sure that whatever you do and with the original source of oysters will be effective and will survive. So the next activities were really focused on first knowing the survival rates and the growth, etc., before getting these oysters from abroad, and could also in lower amounts because we were sure that they would survive at these spots.
I mean, I guess first and foremost, I mean, it goes without saying, in order to do nature-inclusive design effectively, you have to understand the nature in which you're trying to include. So, precursory studies are really critical. Specifically with our oyster tables, one of the things is, preamble studies, I believe, dispersed some sand on the tables, and that showed a high level of mortality, so that was shifted, right? So these initial trials are really, really key. Again, like I said, with the tree reefs, knowing that there's these sort of precursor studies that leads us to sort of be able to lead into these areas with a little bit more knowledge. I will say that to some extent, especially on the Eco-Vende project, there are some things that we just don't have the luxury of knowing if they're going to be effective, and we just have to think about, how we can incorporate what we know about nature. So, for example, the corridor, we don't 100% know if that's going to be highly effective, but, that has to happen at the design phase. So, there is sometimes less flexibility because you want to get these things incorporated into that early design phase. So,
great, thank you. Esther, do you have any thoughts on if the data is showing mostly foraging activity or migration-based activities?
They are typically I think mostly foraging because the great black-backed gulls do not usually migrate. There are a couple of birds that have moved into Canada or North Carolina, but most of them are just foraging, I would say.
Let's see, Matt, this is another one for you. Does your model include clam and scallop population dynamics, and how would you simulate dispersal, recruitment, and growth over the 30-year runs?
So the idea is ultimately to be able to connect into that kind of thing, to have really detailed, scallop sizes, clam locations entirely, to include closed areas. So we've got it relatively well set up to be able to take in all that, but we do need to build that information in as well. And so I think that some of the conversations that folks were having this morning about what are all the covariates that go into modeling stock locations and stuff, that information needs to get brought in to predict where they are.
Okay, great, thanks. I think the next one, whoever wants to take it can take a stab at it. What does increasing biodiversity mean? Any species or particular ones?
Well, if it's related to offshore wind farms, then it would be compared to the situation prior to the offshore wind farm, or compared to a conventionally built wind farm. So if you include nature-inclusive design options in your infrastructure, you would expect an increase in biodiversity compared to a more conventional type of infrastructure.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I think you've well covered it, but I think in terms of a specific species, I think we do look, and you can see with some of the projects that we're progressing, you look to see what are, some of the key species or some of the key concerns and what can be done, right? And focusing that on those kind of associated efforts. And I think, any increase from that baseline over and above sort of offsets and whatnot is what we're really looking for in terms of an increase in biodiversity.
Okay, great. And this one's for Remment again. Does aquaculture inside the wind farms require the removal of mobile gear from the offshore wind areas?
I didn't get that. Require what?
So if you're going to have aquaculture inside the wind farms, does that require removing mobile gear from inside?
Moving the infrastructure of the wind farm, or moving?
So removing mobile gear.
What is mobile gear? Sorry for that.
So trawling, for example.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, if there is aquaculture inside the wind farm, there's no place for mobile gear. So, and currently often there is not even mobile gear allowed in wind farms, depending on the country. In Europe, at least what you're talking about, at least not surrounding the infrastructure itself. There are often always safety zones, and sometimes the entire wind farm is banned from mobile fishing gear. But yeah, so if you put aquaculture in there, you take up space which can be used for commercial catch.
Okay, thanks. Matt, another one for you. How are you incorporating resource patchiness when searching in the risk of contact within wind energy assets when evaluating potential commercial fishing impacts?
So we're using just the best biological and fishery data that we can find, which usually has, there's samples that get done annually, and there'll be, estimates of densities in different places, and we essentially take those estimates of density and scale them up until they represent landings per unit effort.
All right, thanks. Let's see, another one for Michael. So has there been much progress in reducing mortality bats from onshore wind turbines, and what has been tried? And sorry if is that the same question as earlier? Slightly different?
So on onshore wind turbines, the only minimization method we have right now is curtailment, so turning off the turbines. However, there are refinements to that where there's efforts to get as precise as possible, so you're only shutting down when the bats are there to reduce the energy loss. And that's an important factor. So there is a balancing act, but there are effective ways to reduce the risk of population declines, and then, of course, legal protections that could follow.
All right, thanks. So Esther, another one for you. What percentage of the gull population is at risk of collision?
I don't know. Well, yeah, because right now we're not looking at population, we're just looking at behavior and how they use habitat. So I guess when we figure out how the behavior factors into risk, we might be able to maybe try to start getting at population questions, but for now, I don't know.
Thank you. Another one from Matt. What's the typical range of seabed penetration from hydraulic clam dredges, just in general?
It's in my picture, but I'm trying to think. I think it might be 4 or 5 feet, I believe.
All right, another one on the sail drone. So for the bat detectors on the sail drones, can you talk about false positives and false negatives and the detection radius kind of in a general sense?
Yeah, so bat detectors in general, so it's quite difficult to say exactly what the sampling space is because it depends on so many environmental factors and like the head orientation of a bat. But in general, we believe for the low-frequency echolocators that we were mostly picking up, the detection distance is in the range of 30 to 50 meters. And it is a hemispherical microphone, so it's catching about 30 or 50 meters in a circle, more or less, around the detector. False positives, we usually filter it, so it does trigger and record some noise, but our software often identifies that, or a person verifies that it's a bat, so we probably have very few false positives. However, there are, of course, false negatives that have never been quantified in really acoustic literature for bats, and it is a very widespread method, but we know that, except in some occupancy type analysis, where you can get during a night if a bat was present or a species was present or not, it's not well quantified on an individual call level what's missed.
All right, and then I think we have time for one more quick one also about bats. Just, can you tell us what the furthest offshore record of a bat is currently?
Oh, I forget the exact numbers. I think it was a tricolored bat that was recently spotted off South Carolina area, over 100 kilometers, if I remember right. So that would probably be the furthest one that I know about.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, presenters. And thanks, everybody here. And we have a break until...